15 slides to run through. So I'm going to talk very generally about Sustainable Development Goals and Cuba's position within them, and look at how that's been measured internationally and how they're trying to measure them within Cuba, and think about what this means for the way that policy is beginning to address, well, not beginning, but is addressing the SDGs. Okay, so just, I think this should work. Yeah, so it's a quick outline. I'm just going to look at the policies. I'm looking at the progress to date, then the gaps and obstacles in progress, gaps in data, and finally just say a few words about what we found out and what the prospects are. Okay, first of all, first thing to say is that government policies and the SDGs are very closely aligned. The government has been strongly supportive of the drawing up of the SDGs and their presentation in 2015. And in the strategy documents, the lineamientos and the plan 2030, the conceptualización, the goals are all incorporated into those documents. So it's a very clear commitment from the top. On top of that, there's also been this, to the extent that Cuba has this wide participation in the various different forums where the policy documents have been discussed. That's been a process as well of increasing people's awareness, and I think probably particularly on the environmental side, and having environmental protections fed into the policy plans at ministerial level and so on. And there's also, just to demonstrate commitment, there's a national implementation group created in 2017. And as part of that, they've been looking at the indicators, which I will talk about in this presentation. The first thing, this slide is just illustrating the incorporation, or the explicit incorporation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals into Cuban policy. So this is produced by the national implementation group, showing how the ejes, the axes in the Plan 2030 correspond to the Sustainable Development Goals. So they're using all the UN symbols, and they're just showing which ones are applied to which. It's notable really that the social goals are all in the sixth axis here. And they are really you could call them the central goals in terms of Cuba's policy framework. So they look like they're all bunched up together in eje number 6, but they're actually central to the whole process. But the environmental goals are scattered around the various axes, and the economic goals as well. Now, the next slide, I think, just gives you a very brief outline of what the goals are, just to list them. There are 17 of them, and each one of them has targets within the goals drawn up by the UN. And within the targets, there have been listed 244 indicators. So the goals are kind of set up as a bundle. Each one is a bundle of different measurables. And what's supposed to happen is each government is supposed to look at those and look at progress on them, try to assess where their shortcomings are, and try to move towards improvement. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at the most authoritative report that's been done on the Global Sustainable Development Goals report. So it's an annual report now since 2018 called the Sustainable Development Report, led by Jeffrey Sachs. And it produces some very, impactful, very, very clear traffic lighted results and rankings. So what they do, this is an example, there's a lot of graphics in these reports. So they number all the reports along the top, and this is the figure for Latin America and the Caribbean, and they've been traffic lighted. Green is they're near to the goals, red is they're a long way off, orange is they're quite a long way off, and yellow is they're approaching, getting close to the goals. So you get this kind of picture. You can see, if you look at a glance on the Latin America picture, the inequalities 1, which is 10, is very red. And 8 and 9 are pretty poor, which are the economic ones and industry and infrastructure. And you can also notice that within that, there's Cuba's scores are grey for 3 of the goals. Now, mostly the grey ones are when there isn't any data or isn't sufficient data. And most of the other grey ones are in small Caribbean islands. So Cuba's a very large country to have 3 grey areas, and that's because Cuba has a problem is that the Sachs report is resting very heavily, well, entirely on international sources. So that's international institutions, international research. And so where the World Bank doesn't have Cuba data, then it's an unknown. So for example, on poverty, the Sachs report relies on World Bank thresholds, income thresholds, which aren't ranked for Cuba. On inequality, they rely on the Gini coefficient, which isn't ranked for Cuba or isn't measured in Cuba. And on the partnerships or cooperation for the goals, they use spending on education and health as a percentage of GDP, and because they don't have a proper GDP figure, they can't do that. So you can see already that there's a problem with Cuba, particular problems within Cuba. But I want to talk more about the other problems. And one of them, if I go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the dashboard. You see how clear and crisp it all looks. You've got a color for every goal, and you've got every year they say whether it's improving or deteriorating, and you can see this is 2019 one, you have some improvement and some flatlining and some no data. And so what's, yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you want to look more detail at this, some of these things are kind of strange. One in particular is strange is the green, which is achieving the goals for decent work and economic growth. Well, we know that economic growth has been pretty poor, and we know that the pay is, in real terms, is very low. And it seems that they're just using one figure from the ILO, which is the official unemployment figure, which is just very, very misleading. But also on hunger, you can see it's orange rather than getting towards green, and that's because obesity is high and they haven't got any other data. So it's not at all complete. Going to the next one. So you've got a problem. You've got the 2 problems first. You've got the lack of data and the lack of informativeness, really, of these scores, because each of them conceals as much as they reveal, really. If we look at the actual indicators that they use, they're not at all the same as the ones that the UN are using. They're just the ones that they have information for, but they're not the ones that actually reflect what the SDGs are supposed to reflect. And that's most clear in the poverty one, because they're just using the headcount ratio, the number of people under a certain threshold of dollars per day. Whereas the SDG report explicitly uses this as only one of 5 indicators, and the other indicators, they talk about poverty in all its dimensions, they talk about social protection systems, they talk about equal rights and access to basic services, and they talk about exposure and vulnerability to shocks and disasters. Well, clearly, Cuba's been performed incredibly well on managing shocks and disasters. So it doesn't really encapsulate what the SDGs are looking for, and that's also the case in other ones as well. And so I think that by focusing on measurable indicators rather than on actual indicators that reflect the goals, the Sachs report is very misleading. This slide shows how the Sachs report traffic lights on Cuba have changed over time between their 3 reports to date. And what you can see is quite a lot of change from year to year, which kind of shows that it's very much a work in progress. So as they get more information, they add it in. As they get better studies to draw on, they include them. And I think that's, in a way, that's the strength of it, because at least that's an acknowledgement that it's a work in progress and nowhere near to a final say on anything.
A couple of minutes more, Emily.
Oh, no. Okay. All right. Well, just finally, well, not finally. The other thing is perhaps the worst thing about these indicators is the aggregation to make this kind of a ranking of the world. It's actually not meant for that. The SDGs are not meant for that at all. And there was an interesting critique from Jason Hickel, who says aggregation is completely pointless because what you're measuring is if countries get rich, they score high, just like the Human Development Index. But that's not sustainable because clearly there would be an environmental disaster if every country reached the levels of the richest country. So he constructed a new index which subtracts the negatives on the environmental side. And surprise, surprise, Cuba comes out the top of that ranking. And what you see is as income rises, the ranking goes down. But I also wanted to look at, and I haven't got time, that the Cubans have done their own voluntary assessment report. And just to go very quickly, I'll just highlight some of the problems with that report. One is that they've still got missing indicators, which they've admitted readily. They're looking at every indicator. They're trying to find indicators for 244, and they've got 94 of them are missing. There's also the problem of prices and the exchange rate. How can they measure things in meaningful terms when they have so many exchange rates and different controlled prices? But the other one, which is probably more serious, is a kind of an official reticence. So that in each of the SDGs, there's been a different agency studying them. And out of all of them, I found that the water one, which is about access to water and sanitation, was actually the best. It's done by the Cuban Water Institute, Water Services Institute. And the ones on the social indicators went on at length about everything that Cuba has done, but didn't clearly acknowledge what the problems were and what the difficulties were and what the risks were. And I think in a way that kind of defensiveness about their achievements or their pride in their achievements and defensiveness of criticism has kind of led to them stumbling a little bit on acknowledging or using the SDGs for what they're for, which is actually to be helpful for formulating policy. So finally, I've had to rush through that bit. I've actually did a big appendix on a separate report, which I can supply to people, which goes through their voluntary report with all of what they've done for each of the SDGs, if anybody's interested. Yeah, so finally, the policies are strong, but there's unwillingness to admit weaknesses, probably a habit. Progress measurement clearly is flawed. The international one, you really shouldn't take any notice of it because it's so deeply flawed. But the Cuban ones clearly show that Cuba's doing well on social, mixed results, but definitely improving on environmental and with serious problems on the economic side. But as we know, a lot of that depends on the US as well as on their capacity to change or to update their model. And finally, yeah, just there are gaps and obstacles, whoops. And so greater openness would be good, and also better data, published data, because a lot of the data is still unpublished, but that's been something I've been banging on about for a while. So that's really my conclusion. Resources are scarce and some shortcomings and risks are not fully acknowledged, but commitment strong, performance is good, and monitoring and progress are happening. I think that's, you could turn it the other way around. There are really big risks now, both with the reform process and with the economic problems that they're facing. But it's an interesting one. It's an interesting way to look at the way that Cuba's performing and to start a discussion with the Cubans. And I think that they're very open and they're very interested. I had a meeting with Jason Hickel and people from the Cuban Research Institute, and they're very interested in working with international partners on this area. That's all.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Emily. Okay, I think we've now got 5 minutes for questions. Worth bearing in mind, incidentally, that this is going to be followed immediately by Laurence Whitehead's paper, or talk to his paper, on the same thing, the same focus of attention. But over to you. Ruby, you've got your hand up, or is that still up from before?
Sorry, I think that was up from before.
That's okay. Any questions from anybody?
I'm quite happy to take the questions together with Laurence, if that would work better.
We could do that. That might make sense. That gives us an extra few minutes the other end. Are you happy with that, Laurence?
Yes, yes, that's fine by me.
Okay, well, let's do that then and move straight to Laurence. Laurence's text is already up there with the PowerPoints and all the rest, so you can have plenty of time to look at that. But Laurence is just going to talk for his 10 minutes around that, correct?
Correct. So
Emily
has saved me a lot of trouble by telling us a lot about SDGs. I didn't know she was doing that, and she didn't know I was doing this. I'm doing it as from a slightly different angle because I come at it from the politics rather than the economic side and so on. The object of the exercise was to review the distinctiveness of Cuban social policy as compared to other countries, and to discuss the governance problems that follow from having that very distinctive profile. And then I used the SDGs as an external yardstick. I can admit that listening to Emily, they may not be quite so external as I thought. They may be more like an internal yardstick. But at any rate, I pointed out the close convergence between the objectives of the SDGs and the social priorities, at any rate, of the revolutionary regime. And then I go through a series of different goals, and I connect them to a series of different social policy areas. The one that I just would like to spend a couple of minutes on, everybody knows about it, but still, is healthcare, where just to give one or two bits of information that everybody probably will be familiar with. According to the WHO, Cuba has 84 doctors out of an 11.3 million population. 95,000 doctors. That's 84 doctors per 10,000 inhabitants. If that's true, and I think that the WHO's statistics on it are reasonably carefully presented, that's much higher than anywhere else. I mean, to give you a couple of other figures, the United States, it's not 84, it's 26. In Guatemala, it's 3. In Haiti, it's 2. We're talking about a huge order of magnitude difference. Of those 84 doctors per 10,000, they may not be exactly the same kind of doctors as you find elsewhere, but in some cases they will be more appropriate for the health problems that they're dealing with, even if they're not, University of Houston world-class surgeons and so forth. At any rate, that's what the statistics tell us. And of those 84 per 10,000, 68 are on the island, and 16, a very high proportion, are doing work off the island. And in fact, some evidence is, I'm not sure it's absolutely clear, but the indications are that health services are the largest source of foreign exchange in Cuba in 2020. So this is a very unusual and very distinctive profile. It's accentuated by the fact that the Cubans not only provide basic health care, they also undertake biotechnological and vaccine research and so on. They have, for example, one of the vaccines which is being produced as a possible vaccine against COVID is a homemade Cuban vaccine called Soberana. I'm not saying it's the best, but this is a country with very unusual capacities and a very unusual emphasis, which needs to be of course related to all the other social policy and economic issues that Cuba faces. In the paper, I discuss a little bit more about why they may have followed this priority, why it has been so important, and why the controversies related to it. I go on then to go through a series of other SDGs like food security, where the issues are a bit more complicated, the area of transport, which is really quite out of line again and not so good. We can discuss, I mean, I go into the details of it, of the pros and cons of the Cuban transport profile. I discuss the human settlements as that relates to SDG 11. I discuss the very controversial question about Cuban education. On the whole, I think I accept most of the evidence about Cuban education and its very high performance, but there are controversies about that. And then well, again, the profile is a bit different. Full and productive employment and work for all. In fact, the Cuban problem may be that there's such full and productive employment that it's not productive. That a lot of people are being employed in sectors which are in state employment, which is both not necessarily the best use of the labor and is also receiving, by international standards, very low remuneration rates. So then I go on to some of the other questions. The paper goes on at great length. Some of the points that Emily has just raised about, for example, the inappropriateness of the poverty threshold of the World Bank measure, because on the face of it, if you use the exchange rate and you limit yourself to earned income, an awful lot of people in Cuba are getting under the poverty threshold, but that misses out all the other things about remuneration, and it's distorted by the exchange rate policy, which makes it impossible to know what the GDP is. So I go into those questions. Finally, because time is running short and I want to have an exchange with you and with Emily in particular, the second half of the paper deals with, well, all right, it's not just a case of tracking the distinctive profile of Cuba on individual social policy matters. All the social policy issues that I've discussed are interconnected. They are the product of an overall model with both a social, an economic, and a political structure and logic to it. And there are serious, very serious problems of governance going forward if those policies are to be fulfilled and developed in the way that the Cubans themselves have committed to do with the United Nations under the SDGs. So on the subject of governance, very quickly, I talk about the issue of command and control, the issue of rationing, the issue of the dual currency system. I also talk about the problems of collective responsibility for the policy choices, some of the things that Emily has been discussing in relation to the procedures by which the Cuban government has been monitoring these questions. And then I relate it to broader equity issues, which are some of which, it has to be said, if you look at it, I mean, my evidence is that Cubans are under pressure, which is making it quite hard for them to fulfill some of the equity commitments that they are. And then finally, of course, I come to the external blockade, but I try to put the external blockade in context and to suggest that there are actually two rather than one issue there. There's an internal policy inertia problem, as well as an external economic sanctions problem. Some Cuban economists now are saying the worsening of the sanctions from the United States and the crisis with Venezuela may just be enough to force them to overcome the internal inertia. And therefore, rather than being the stranglehold, it may be the thing that makes it possible for the Cubans to fulfill their hopes in the next 10 years. But there are obviously many problems about that which I haven't got time to, which I've touched on in my paper, which I haven't got time to speak about now.
Many thanks indeed, Laurence. Absolutely perfectly timed, and that gives us therefore full 15 minutes, if we want, for questions. So over to you. You can question each other by all means, the two of you, but equally we can invite questions from elsewhere.
I'll just make a couple of comments on Laurence's paper.
Yep.
Just first, I mean, obviously we're covering the same ground, and I don't know if you saw the voluntary report, but it's interesting because it shows how much they've acknowledged. But I think I completely agree with you that there are some things which obviously they haven't performed well on, some things that are really under threat, and I think that that's, you know, health and education. Inequality is obviously rising, and the sustainability of the ration system is in serious question. The fact that the whole price system is in question. That's one point. And I think that they need to face that more clearly and talk about the threats and the negative trends that we've seen in the last few years. The second one is about this, you know, are the difficulties going to force economic reform, or and I think that there's another argument that says that the trouble with in a crisis, you know, you need emergency planning, you know, and so in many ways, the harder things get, the harder it will be to introduce some of the reforms that are needed to make the economy more efficient, to allow it to go forward. So I think that there's, you know, both of those things are happening. I know that a lot of the Cubans, the economists who want more reform, are saying this is the time we must do it, but actually this is possibly the hardest time to do a lot of the really important things.
Well, I would agree with that. And actually, having followed those debates for several years, the economists I know who are currently the Cuban economists who are now saying this might be the thing that would enable us to get forward are also, not so long ago, the ones who were saying, why has it been so slow? Why have we missed all these opportunities? Why is there so much inertia? I think that they're good on the economics of it, but not really entirely able to explain in a satisfactory way how policy making is undertaken and what the internal, that's why I stress the point about internal inertia. The big discussion about that, which I heard about a month ago, was basically saying there will be a new, I think is it the 8th Communist Party thing, and it's expected to take place next spring, and it will be the crucial opportunity for them to take on board what these economists have been saying and take on board the stark dilemmas, the things that are not sustainable if you just carry on the way you are at present, and therefore, theoretically, to embrace. I mean, the fundamental question becomes, what are you going to do about the dual exchange rate? And it's surely harder to unify the dual exchange rate when you haven't got any foreign exchange than it would be at a period when you had more foreign exchange. That's a very simple, basic and problematic reality.
Okay, thank you. William Rowlandson. William, you had your hand up. Are you there?
Yes, can you see me? I have my camera on.
But we will.
Well, I've put my camera on.
Yes, that's it, fine. We got you now.
Hola a todos. Hello, everyone. Thank you for both those wonderful talks. Really interesting. I'm thinking, in relation to Emily, your talk about SDGs, obviously there are many problems with SDGs. As a framework, they're very leaky, but they're also wonderful ambitions and great goals. But the trouble is, obviously, the moment they change from being goals to being ranking, then clearly corners are going to be cut. It's a sort of, we've seen it within the university system. The moment that there's any index of SDG achievement, you're going to be hit with all those wild variables. And so that's clearly the point here. But there's one area which is very, very difficult indeed to measure, and that's the 17th one, which is partnership. And my question is really about, you mentioned that the framework, that's a grey area. It has a grey little circle on the index there. Now, partnership is a very strange one to try and sort of quantify, and it seems a very arbitrary one as well. And I'm wondering, and this is my question to both of you really, is the SDG that for many people is considered the most important of all at the moment clearly is SDG 13, which is action to climate change. And can either of you speak to how Cuba has been leading or not leading or participating in an international discourse at a policy level in relation clearly to climate and the necessity of decarbonisation? Now, of course, one of the problems that we've seen is that the rise out of the special period has been one of increased carbonisation. So are there great plans of decarbonisation in Cuba, and is it recognised internationally as a key performer of SDG 13?
Shall I go first?
Please do, yes.
Yeah, okay. I agree on the goals versus rankings, and that's precisely, I think, what's kind of created a defensiveness or a kind of, blowing their trumpet rather than addressing the issues on the part of the Cubans. And it's very negative, and it doesn't help, and it's not what the goals are for. How to measure partnerships? Yeah, actually, when I looked at the indicators, I couldn't actually dig out the indicators for partnerships. The World Bank was just using spending on health and education as a percentage of total spending. And actually in 2020, they included it as a green, because it's very high, as according to the fiscal accounts, which are a problem of exchange rates even there. But on the climate change thing, it's interesting because the Tarea Vida is mainly about adaptation rather than mitigation of climate change. And the reason is obviously because Cuba is a very, very, very small contributor to global emissions. Having said that, they're on principle, they've always joined in the discussion saying that, this has to be addressed, and particularly obviously pointed to the fact that the US is the highest carbon emitter, after some of the Middle Eastern countries, in the world per head. The US constantly pointing to China as being the total. But anyway, but for them, actually, decarbonisation will be alternative renewable energy. And that is a priority because they believe in it, but mainly because they need to, because it takes up such a huge and very widely fluctuating proportion of their import capacity. And it constant, they keep hitting crises. Obviously, if somebody stops the deliveries, that's a problem. But it's also a problem if they have a shortage of foreign exchange at any time. And so they're really pushing for that. But the problem there is they need to get the finance. And it's interesting, actually, because in the last couple of years, they've been working more closely with more support from UN agencies and from the EU in that area. But the amount of finance is very low compared to what it needs to be.
I think it's also an area where they are not doing such good technological research as they are in health. They are doing some things, but not enough. So there were ideas about bagasse, for example, the use of the waste material from the sugar industry as a raw material to substitute for oil. They really do need to substitute for their domestic sources of oil cover about a third of their demand, and their ability to acquire it internationally is just not going to be there. And this has been this is one of the examples of inertia, really, where there have been half-hearted plans, there have been partial initiatives. The most recent thing that I looked at for my paper had to do with, electric bikes. But the transport system in Cuba is not well structured for people going around on bikes, even if they're electric powered. There are all sorts of things like that that are in the works, that are possible. And the Cubans are, have high education, have organizational capacity. So there are things that could be done there. But up to now, my sense, in my paper, I suggest a number of missed opportunities, really. By the way, that's SDG 13, but you talking about SDG 17, I think you started with that, did you not? Mm-hmm. It says international cooperation and the promotion of meaningful trade liberalization. Now, one part of that is very nice. The international cooperation would be against UN sanctions, Helms-Burton and all the rest of it. But the meaningful trade liberalization isn't exactly what they have in mind, and that reflects, that again is part of the underlying issue about the dual exchange rate.
Yeah, just on the transport quickly, because I've been involved in a transport project with the Havana Transport Authority is now working closely with the EU on a sustainable urban mobility plan. And so we're going to see some, I think, in the next few years, we're going to see some interesting developments there.
Okay, thank you to both of you, all three of you. I've got two questions indicated, Jean Stubbs and Pa. Jean, over to you.
Okay, can you see me and hear me?
Yep.
Hi.
We will.
Thanks, Emily and Laurence. Of course, you're looking at the international and the national. And what we were doing with the documentary, which we'll be discussing tomorrow, was the local. And it seems to me that one of the key, there are several key issues in how Cuba's going to move forward. And one is how you get away from the national command economy to the local, and how the local takes on more power to do things. I mean, we left Caibarien, a very vulnerable coastal town, with an excellent program within Tarea Vida and the SD and the Sustainable Development Program for 2030. But at the local level, the problems were immense and the inertia was immense. So how do you, it seems to me that one of that's part of how Cuba is going to be able to break out of this or not. I mean, if you couple that with, for example, the recent information, and Pedro Monreal, as you will both know, covered that. 5% of investment last year went to agriculture. 35% went into construction and tourism and such. The tourism economy, which is the latest commodity frontier, has collapsed with COVID. Whether it will recover, how soon it will recover. But the key at the moment is Cuba can't feed itself.
Absolutely.
Because it's locked into, and has been for centuries, primary exports, and then with those you buy in your foodstuffs. Now the carbon issue it's an issue for large-scale agriculture. It's not an issue for small-scale farming. And the small-scale farming is much more efficient at the moment than the large-scale agriculture. So we're looking at things that are really complex, far beyond what the goals might be internationally, what the goals might be nationally, but how it plays out locally and how much that can move forward. I know it's the biggie, isn't it? I mean, it's the elephant in the room. So
let's take Paul's question as well, and you can answer both of them.
It's not a question. It's not a question. It's just to alert people that Temas, as usual, Revista Temas is doing a wonderful job asking a lot of these questions and bringing together experts in Cuba to answer those questions and experts outside Cuba. So just this morning I was looking for something else, and 2nd of September, I think they had a Temas WhatsApp dialogue, so they're trying to do them by WhatsApp these days, on something like Podemos cultivar lo que consumimos, about exactly that same question. And a couple of weeks before that, just relating to Laurence's points about healthcare and social policy in general, they have some quite interesting data on the impact of COVID on gender, age, and possibly one more category axes. So just to remind you that Catalejo is what it's called. Catalejo is their blog where they collect a lot of the debates or a lot of the information that feeds into the debates. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, over to the two of you to answer Jean's point.
Well, very quickly, the command and control question is really about the absence of sufficient decentralization, I would say, and very difficult to, I know Diaz-Canel is supposed to be trying to do that, and so on, but it runs against an awful lot of bureaucratic inertia and structural inheritances. The fundamental question, which is why I talk about internal inertia, is it's staring them in the face. Since at least a decade ago, they had to do something about being self-sufficient in food, and they ought to be able to do it. If there's a place that ought to be able to feed itself, it's Cuba. But that means a change in the, I mentioned, I'm afraid, going right the way back to René Dumont in 1970, pointing out that, socialism might be good for some things, but it wasn't a way to generate agricultural surplus. And indeed, the Vietnamese came to that conclusion. It's not a case of overthrowing the Communist Party. It's a case of recognizing the realities of rural production, how it has to be done from below in the light of what the actual agricultural circumstances and opportunities are in particular locations. And as we know, well, I remember the Cordon de la Havana, if you want an example of that mentality hasn't really gone away.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe I'll just make a very, very small comment. I think that what you're both saying is that the food and decentralization are like at the forefront of what they're trying to achieve at the moment. And there is a lot going on the ground, but there are some fundamental problems. And one of them, decentralization goes against a long tradition, but it's also the question of prices as well. If you've got, the prices, if people can't actually make decisions based on what they can buy and sell at what prices, then you have to have somebody administering it. And if you have to have someone administering it, then that slows down the process and makes them less responsive. So it's all tied in with the reform process. But I think that, there is so much going on. I don't know if we got Ricardo Núñez coming along to the meeting at some stage, but he's been doing a lot on that. There's a whole load of people in the University of Havana who've been working very hard on trying to build capacity of the municipal governments and trying to increase the innovation culture. And, there's a lot of work going on in those areas. And obviously,
Emily, Jorge Núñez.
Jorge, yeah, Jorge Núñez.
Yes, that's the perfect segue, because we're just about to listen to an audio and look at a PowerPoint from Jorge Núñez and Aurora Fernández about local development and higher education. So it'll fit in really well with both of your papers.
So at which point, thank you really very much indeed, the two of you. We will, as Pa said, we're just about to present the PowerPoint that Aurora prepared for us. And with the audio, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. So if you just talk amongst yourselves for 2 seconds, and I will get all of that set up. Like this.
Emily, we should get together.
Definitely, I think we should share the...
It looks like we've both been writing the same paper, in a sense. Mine is a working paper so far, but if you... I would certainly need to footnote a lot of your material, and it's possible that there could be some productive exchange with some of mine too.
Yeah, okay, well, we'll talk later. Yeah? Okay, great.
Okay.
Right, so we're gonna start with our next paper, which is, as Tony said, a PowerPoint and an audio. So that's Aurora Fernández González, who you saw this morning giving the opening address, and Jorge Núñez Jóver from the University of Havana, Desarrollo Local en Cuba, Papel de la Educación Superior. So the audio doesn't follow the PowerPoint exactly, but we're going to do our best. Okay, here we go.
Es que el tema del desarrollo local ha pasado a ocupar un lugar relevante en la actualización del modelo de desarrollo económico y social cubano. Esto es así porque a partir de los acuerdos del 7º Congreso del Partido y las cuestiones debatidas y aprobadas en la Asamblea Nacional del Poder Popular, ahora el desarrollo local aparece como un tema central de la agenda del desarrollo del país. No un tema periférico como frecuentemente lo ha sido en el pasado, sino esencialmente como un tema central de esas transformaciones. Quiere decir que se apuesta al desarrollo desde los municipios, desde las comunidades, para transformar integralmente el país. Así, por ejemplo, aparece ahí un lineamiento de los que están contenidos en la política económica y social, lineamiento 17, que ustedes pueden observar, y ahí pues ahí se describe exactamente qué es lo que se pretende con el impulso al desarrollo de los territorios. Lo mismo, y todavía con más acento, aparece en la Constitución de la República, aprobada, la última Constitución de la República que aprobamos, en el artículo 168, se le da un gran protagonismo a los municipios. Esto marca un punto trascendental dentro de las transformaciones del modelo de desarrollo en Cuba. Ahora el municipio aparece como un protagonista fundamental de la transformación. Eso es una novedad. Por otro lado, ahora comentamos en la presentación un poco cómo el Ministerio de Educación Superior, cómo el sistema de educación superior ha venido abordando ese tema del desarrollo local. Como ustedes pueden ver por las fechas mencionadas en las láminas anteriores, ha sido en los 4 o 5 últimos años que se ha producido ya una formulación global como país con respecto al tema del desarrollo local. Sin embargo, dentro del Ministerio de Educación Superior se venían produciendo desde mucho antes transformaciones y posicionamientos importantes para entender las opciones de la educación superior como en su respaldo posible al desarrollo local. Así, por ejemplo, ya en el año 2001 apareció una novedad institucional muy importante, que fue la creación de los centros universitarios municipales, a partir de lo cual prácticamente la educación superior está en todos los municipios del país, presente de una u otra manera. Eso apareció ya desde el principio de 2001, desde el principio del siglo, en 2001, con una iniciativa que desplegó sobre todo el compañero Fidel, encaminada a universalizar la educación superior en Cuba. En el año 2006, el Ministerio de Educación Superior, a partir de una propuesta formulada por la Universidad de La Habana, por propuesta de la Cátedra de Ciencia, Tecnología y Sociedad de la Universidad de La Habana, se crea una red universitaria del conocimiento y la innovación para el desarrollo local, por sus siglas UCIT, que enredó a todas las universidades, centros universitarios municipales, en un esfuerzo conjunto por respaldar el desarrollo local. En el 2012, ese es el trabajo que se acumuló a partir de 2006, las experiencias que UCIT iba arrojando, llevan en el 2012 al Ministerio de Educación Superior a formular un objetivo dentro de su planificación estratégica directamente respaldado a sostener el desarrollo local, a impulsar el desarrollo local. Si dejó de ser una iniciativa de un grupo académico respaldada por el Ministerio para convertirse en política del Ministerio el impulso al desarrollo local. Fue realmente entre los organismos de la Administración Central del Estado en Cuba un organismo pionero en ese sentido. Y ahí ustedes tienen un mapa que aparece en una de las láminas, donde se puede observar la distribución de los centros universitarios municipales en Cuba. Cuba tiene 168 municipios y ahí aparecen 122 centros universitarios municipales. Ahí lo que pasa es lo siguiente, que en las cabeceras provinciales, excepto en Artemisa, no hay centros universitarios municipales, porque están las universidades mayores, a las cuales están adscritos esos centros universitarios municipales. Pero además hay un grupo de municipios en el país que no tienen centros universitarios municipales formalmente establecidos, pero tienen filiales universitarias, con lo cual la educación superior el mapa de la educación superior es coextensivo con el mapa del país y prácticamente está presente en casi todos los lugares. Creo que podemos convenir que en principio eso ofrece grandes potencialidades para el respaldo al desarrollo local en materia de conocimiento, tecnología e innovación. A continuación viene alguna lámina que se refiere a los conceptos con los cuales nosotros estamos manejando estas cuestiones. El primero es que al proyectarse hacia el desarrollo local se fortalece la pertinencia social de la universidad, es decir, se fortalece su capacidad de responder a las necesidades y demandas del país. El tema de la pertinencia social es un tema clave en la agenda histórica de la educación superior cubana en estos últimos 60 años. La educación superior se concibe a sí misma como un actor que debe involucrarse activamente en las transformaciones económicas, sociales, culturales, políticas que el país desarrolla. Y permite ese posicionamiento de la educación superior, permite crear vínculos cada vez más estrechos entre las universidades, el gobierno y los restantes actores, sector productivo, administración pública, sector privado, sector estatal, con todos los actores de los territorios, pues es posible fomentar esos vínculos a través de este enfoque que hemos planteado. Otro concepto es que el desarrollo local permite crear capacidades en los territorios. Porque está muy bien eso de apostar a los municipios, está muy bien eso de apostar a los territorios. Pero si no se crean capacidades allí para realizar los procesos de innovación, las transformaciones tecnológicas, las transformaciones organizacionales, etcétera, difícilmente se puede avanzar en ese desarrollo. La educación superior concentra una buena parte del potencial humano del país y una buena parte de las capacidades científicas del país. Este posicionamiento de la educación superior a favor del desarrollo local, entonces es un tema fundamental para el éxito posible que ese desarrollo local pueda tener. Y ahí apuntamos también que los CUN son elementos muy importantes de ese proceso. Quiero subrayarlo. Cada provincia tiene sus propias universidades provinciales, hay entidades, hay centros de investigación y desarrollo, hay una multiplicidad de actores, pero el centro universitario municipal es aquella instancia que está allí en el municipio, un municipio donde pueden vivir 35.000 personas, que puede ser un municipio agropecuario, con un nivel de desarrollo modesto, pero allí hay una capacidad de conocimiento instalada directamente, que es la que el Centro Universitario Municipal nos ofrece. El punto, digamos, que de cambio, por así decirlo, que podemos notar en los últimos tiempos es que apenas en julio de este año se aprobó ya por el Estado cubano una política para impulsar el desarrollo territorial. Política en la cual la educación superior participó también entre muchos actores que contribuyeron a la creación de esa política. Esa política es ya una manera de materializar, de concretar lo planteado en los lineamientos de la política económica y social y lo planteado en la Constitución que vimos en las primeras láminas. Es ahora sí un impulso importante al desarrollo local dentro del país. Ahí se habla del objetivo que persigue esa política de desarrollo territorial, es el impulso al desarrollo de los territorios, destaca nuevamente la importancia del municipio, comunidad base de todos estos procesos, declara la autonomía de los municipios, declara la importancia de generar allí transformaciones económico-productivas interesantes, que permita evitar o limar, disminuir las diferencias de desarrollo que existen entre ellos. Ese objetivo ustedes lo tienen en sus láminas. Aparece a continuación la definición de desarrollo local. Observen algunos rasgos que ahí se mencionan. Se habla de un proceso endógeno, participativo, tema fundamental, innovador, que se encarga de articular intereses entre actores, territorios, escala municipal, provincial, sectorial, nacional, donde los gobiernos tienen un rol protagónico, pero allí mismo la gestión del conocimiento y la innovación es un asunto absolutamente fundamental para fomentar la calidad de vida, el bienestar de los ciudadanos, sus capacidades de desarrollo, y eso es justamente lo que el desarrollo local persigue, pero eso, insisto, hay que respaldarlo por conocimiento, hay que respaldarlo por capacidades humanas para impulsar ese proceso. ¿Cuáles son las acciones necesarias para impulsar el desarrollo local? Bueno, primero hay que crear capacidades, esto que les decía. De hecho, ya en Cuba en estos momentos hay aproximadamente una década ya de impulso por diferentes iniciativas al desarrollo local. De hecho, en más de 60 municipios cubanos tenemos estrategias de desarrollo municipal ya construidas previamente. Bueno, aquí no estamos hablando de que aquí se va a empezar el trabajo. Queremos decir que en la lógica actual, casi que lo primero que hay que hacer, o de lo primero que hay que hacer, es preocuparnos todavía más por el tema de la creación de capacidades que permitan la conducción estratégica del desarrollo local, que permitan la gestión de proyectos para el desarrollo local, etc. Que permitan el desarrollo de la innovación, políticas sistémicas de innovación a nivel local, para mejorar el despliegue, la preparación del potencial humano, del potencial de los trabajadores y campesinos que en esos municipios actúan. La tercera acción se refiere a la consolidación de la relación entre la educación superior y los gobiernos y los restantes actores locales. Eso se trata de generar sinergias, generar encuentros, compartir, trabajar juntos. Eso es algo que un sistema como el cubano, con un sistema cohesivo, bastante cohesivo, es más fácil hacerlo que en otros lugares, pero de todas formas no es tan sencillo, porque cada actor puede tener sus propios intereses, sus propias visiones, y conciliar todo eso a través de una interacción multiactoral, con una conducción común de los procesos, es un objetivo que no es tan sencillo de alcanzar, pero en eso estamos trabajando. ¿Dónde estamos ahora? Fíjense que comenzamos esta narración en 2001, cuando crean las sedes universitarias municipales. ¿Dónde estamos ahora, en 2020? Bueno, nosotros creemos que se ha fortalecido la proyección de las universidades, de los centros universitarios municipales, de una serie de redes tecnocientíficas o sociotécnicas, como ustedes prefieran, y centros de investigación que tiene la educación superior, han fortalecido su proyección al desarrollo local. En realidad, antes de que esto ocurriera, la proyección era más bien de tipo sectorial y con una fuerte concentración nacional. Ahora, todo ese dispositivo de conocimiento que tiene la educación superior, toda esa institucionalidad de conocimientos que tiene la educación superior, se está orientando cada vez más hacia el desarrollo local. Por otra parte, el tema educación superior, desarrollo local, no es solo un tema práctico de primera importancia, sino que se ha convertido también en un tema de trabajo académico que permite, sobre la base de esa teoría, de esos desarrollos teóricos, me refiero a hacer investigación científica sobre el desarrollo local, sobre el papel de la educación superior, sobre el papel de la ciencia y la tecnología en el desarrollo local, sobre la formación de potencial humano para el desarrollo local, y todo eso expresado en publicaciones, en libros, tesis de maestría, tesis de doctorado. Ese trabajo académico es un soporte importante para las transformaciones prácticas que pretendemos. ¿Dónde estamos? Continuamos. Bueno, yo creo que hoy, a diferencia de lo que ocurría hace un tiempo atrás, la educación superior es reconocida como un actor relevante por todas las instituciones y programas que el país aborda en el desarrollo territorial. Es difícil que alguien hoy hable de desarrollo local y no piense en las universidades. De eso, por cierto, se encarga muy claramente el propio gobierno central. El presidente de la Nación, al frente de su equipo de ministros, visita, ahora por la pandemia, claro, eso está limitado, pero visita frecuentemente los territorios y allí trata por todos los medios de enfatizar el papel de la universidad en los territorios, traza puentes con los ministerios, traza puentes con los autores locales. Yo creo que ese posicionamiento de la educación superior dentro del desarrollo local es algo bastante intenso en este momento y bastante bien reconocido. Y de manera general los gobiernos locales prácticamente se basan, tienen como uno de sus pilares principales para la gestión a la educación superior en su apoyo. Pero hay muchos retos y muchos desafíos que vencer todavía. Primero, nosotros no contamos sin duda con todo el potencial humano, las capacidades de gestión del conocimiento e innovación que se requieren para impulso a las estrategias de desarrollo municipal y provincial. Nos falta. Y en eso estamos trabajando. Se están creando nuevos programas, nuevos procesos de capacitación que involucran tanto a los productores como incluso a los gobiernos, a los gestores, a los empresarios. Si hay un trabajo de creación, de formación de potencial humano, de creación de capacidad bastante importante. Hay mucho que hacer todavía en materia de innovación tecnológica y organizacional, no solo tecnológica, también organizacional, para impulsar el desarrollo local. Nosotros podemos decir que existen excelentes ejemplos en estos momentos de alianzas, gobierno, educación superior en muchísimos municipios, posiblemente hasta 70, 80 municipios cubanos. Esas alianzas hoy en día son muy importantes, en otros están más rezagados y ahí hay un tema que tenemos que seguir insistiendo. Es necesario fortalecer la vinculación estratégica con los gobiernos, con los demás actores locales, para fortalecer las estrategias de desarrollo municipal. Se ha avanzado mucho, pero queda todavía un territorio importante por avanzar. Ya entrando en las conclusiones, bueno, decimos que redondeamos lo que hemos dicho hasta ahora, afirmando que sí, la educación superior se ha posicionado como un actor relevante en los procesos de producción, difusión y uso de los conocimientos que el desarrollo local demanda, y se ha convertido en un aliado importante de los gobiernos y otros actores que se mueven dentro de los municipios. Esa es una transformación muy importante. No ha sido así tradicionalmente. El espacio de educación superior no estaba en el desarrollo local. No era esa su proyección principal. pero no lo es además en la mayor parte de los países con los cuales uno se mueve dentro de América Latina. Sin embargo, hay un espacio muy importante de desarrollo, hay un nicho de desarrollo donde hay unas potencialidades grandes para impulsar el bienestar y la calidad de vida de los ciudadanos. Hay también como otra conclusión que es necesario fortalecer la integración de los procesos universitarios, me refiero a la investigación, a la extensión, a la formación, tiene que ser mejor integrado. Hay que orientar mejor los claustros, es decir, los cuerpos de profesores de los centros universitarios municipales, mejorar su composición. Hay que mejorar la infraestructura de esos centros universitarios municipales. Hay que mejorar sus relaciones con las universidades provinciales, ¿sí? Con su sistema de trabajo, con las sedes centrales, con sus facultades, centros de estudio, etc. Otra conclusión es que efectivamente la política de gobierno encaminada a fortalecer el vínculo de educación superior y desarrollo local ha avanzado en la consolidación de esos vínculos, en la generalidad de los territorios, y que los CUN están cumpliendo importantes acciones de gestión del conocimiento y la innovación en numerosos municipios. Eso en esencia lo que queríamos compartir con ustedes. Las condiciones son un poco anómalas, nos hubiera gustado presentarlo en vivo, discutirlo en vivo con ustedes, hubiéramos podido profundizar en muchos aspectos, pero por lo menos de esta manera le transmitimos un mensaje básico sobre el esfuerzo que estamos haciendo en consolidar los vínculos de la educación superior con el desarrollo local para fomentar el avance de nuestro país. Muchas gracias.
Right, well, we gave them the full 20 minutes, as I'm sure you understand, simply because they couldn't be here to answer any questions. But what we are saying is, any questions you've got, if you put them on the chat feature, we will relay them to both of them, and they can then contact you directly to give you answers. Okay?
Excellent. So we're about to move into the last panel for today, and then we're going to move on to drinks. But could we just have a couple of minutes, because I've just received something from one of the paper givers that needs to be added. So if you just wait for 2 minutes, and then we'll start again with Gabriel Arce Riocabo, Chris Hull, and Teishan Latner. 2 minutes. Gabriel, I'll be with you in 1 second. I'm just going to share your PowerPoint. Okay? Right, can we all see that PowerPoint? we see your own PowerPoint?
No.
No, not yet. Okay.
No.
Right, let's do it. Yes?
Yes, thank you.
Good.
So I'm going to keep it in that mode just because it goes a bit funny when it's not in that mode. So if you just say to me next, is that okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
Excellent. Over to you, Gabriel Arce Riocabo, who's at the CUNY Graduate Center, and his paper is entitled Cosmopolítica, Otros, compromisos y otros viajes del cine en Cuba. Over to you, Gabriel.
Gracias. Bueno, gracias por la oportunidad de presentar. Primero, como verán, acorté el título aquí en el PowerPoint como acorté todo. Así que me expondré brevemente de lo que es el ensayo, pero el ensayo completo está compartido en el grupo. Esta ponencia mira al cine desde la idea del concepto de cosmopolítica, idea acuñada por Bruce Robbins y Feng Shi, como sustituto de la idea de compromiso. Busca describir un trabajo intelectual no de barricadas, sino donde prima el esfuerzo para la traducibilidad mutua. Next slide, please. Sartre definía el compromiso como un viaje unidireccional. Por ejemplo, cito, mis amigos cubanos me han dicho cuando vuelvas a París, habla de la Revolución Cubana. Robbins incita a resaltar ejemplos donde rige otra programática, donde la movilidad, cito, necesaria a la observación y la comparación no esté monopolizada por un lado, donde la palabra lugareño, local, ha perdido su fuerza de contraste. Aquí hablaré de viajeros que hicieron cine ensayo. La colaboración necesaria para hacer una película, su demora sobre la actualidad y sus nulas posibilidades comerciales implican la fe en el trabajo y un cierto profesionalismo que es una de las bases, según Robbins, de la cosmopolítica. No es en este sentido meramente incidental que los reportajes de Sartre sobre Cuba en 1960 se publicaran en François, el tabloide más leído de Francia. Esta visibilidad es programática para su idea del intelectual. El cine de ensayo implica una tarea menos de diseminación que de reflexión. Salut les Cubains, de Agnes Varda, del cual hablaré hoy, Retornar a Baracoa, de Guillaume Landrian, y Havana, de Jana Bokova, que están en el ensayo, pero que no profundizaré hoy, son obras que partan del paradigma del viaje, pero que se resisten a viajar de la forma autorizada. Hacen cine a contrapelo de la sincronización de discursos entre institucionalidad cubana y simpatizante extranjero de la revolución. En 1960, Edgar Morin definía al intelectual francés como todo escritor que tomaba posición sobre Argelia. Durante lo que ahora se ha dado por llamar Global 60s, intelectual vino a englobar todo aquel que opinaba de, hacía gira por o se radicaba en Cuba. El viaje a Cuba es en ese sentido un espacio mítico, pero también de los pocos autorizados a contar ciertas verdades. Manuel Zayas pone el dedo, tercera. Gracias. Aquí pueden ver una tarjeta de crédito de Theodore Christensen, que fue el director de la primera escuela de cine en Cuba, revolucionaria. Una tarjeta que le daba barra libre en el Hotel Havana Libre, Otrora Havana Hilton. Manuel Zayas pone el dedo en la llaga al señalar la relación directa entre tolerancia oficial y espacios nominalmente internacionales dentro de la isla. Preparaba un documental sobre Guillaume Landrian en la Escuela Internacional de Cine y Televisión, cuando su director, Julio García Espinosa, dijo, y cito, no me gusta que hagas esa película, pero me dijo que no puede prohibirme porque esa era una escuela internacional. Centrándonos en Salut les Cubains, es una película que parte de la alusión al cineasta Chris Marker para ponderar el papel del intercambio intelectual en crear la visión europea de Cuba. Próxima diapositiva. Varda no busca la definición, sino que desde el título se dirige a Cuba. Su forma de acercarse reflexiona sobre la autocomplacencia cosmopolita de visitantes y de anfitriones. hace una crítica premonitoria del papel del mediador, donde las palabras de Fidel Castro se pierden en la traducción de los subtítulos. La gravedad de esta incomprensión se deja sobreentender cuando, y cito, otro simpatizante de la revolución, Carlos María Gutiérrez, uruguayo, cuando los discursos son el gobierno mismo, interrumpir su transmisión pone en duda el proyecto de iluminación letrada. Los reportajes de Landrian, como Retornar a Baracoa, también emplean la forma del documental de viaje, mientras desautorizan sus preceptos informativos y desarrollistas. Es importante recordar que su cosmopolitismo insular, el mirar más allá del vedado, donde se hospedaban las delegaciones, era también parte de la justificación del proyecto de Estado pregonado entre invitados. El ensayista Pino Santos, por ejemplo, instó a Sartre a mirar más allá de la ciudad de los americanos para entender el subdesarrollo. La visión del campo de Landrian transforma la idea de beneficencia letrada frente a los tours estilo 72 horas con Fidel, de Wright Mills o Solando, por ejemplo, pero no interesantemente con Huey Newton. Filmaba Landrian viviendo en casa de los campesinos, compartiendo su cayuca llena de puerco asado y arroz. Sartre, cosmopolito a la antigua usanza, idealiza su destino. La revolución venía envuelta en una singularidad mítica que baja de las, cito, cima de la Sierra Maestra, oculta entre las nubes. La cosmopolítica, en cambio, pone en duda este idealismo, esta tendencia a encontrar un ser mítico, casi arraigado casi de una manera heideggeriana. La cosmopolítica quiere aterrizar. Próximo diapositiva. Ok, esta no es, esta es de Jana Bokova, pero igual da cuenta de, es la siguiente. Esta. Las primeras imágenes de Retornar a Baracoa son precisamente caras alzadas ante un avión que se posa en pista por primera vez. La Baracoa de Guillaume Landrian es el estruendo de una fábrica, caras mudas que miran directo a cámara y la omnipresencia radiofónica de Fidel. En el caso de Bokova tenemos un aproximamiento al estilo liberal del telereportaje y trabajar con la BBC para ella supone la posibilidad de ocupar críticamente los presuntos del periodismo televisivo. La tele inglesa, ella dice, es única en el mundo por la relación privilegiada que mantiene con el cine. Ustedes los británicos me dirán si eso sigue siendo cierto. Eso es en 1989. Así que imagino que mucho ha cambiado. De todas formas, es una manera de cavar en terreno muy bien arrado por la mitificación. Y pasamos a esa diapositiva anterior. La anterior, perdón. Sí, esto es el título que abre la película, donde la idea de Cuba se ve envuelta como en una caja de puros. Bokova compone un collage con la ficción literaria de los autores non gratos de los 60, el archivo cinematográfico e imágenes de la cruda actualidad. Esta documentación contagiada es una forma de dar un retrato de la urbe, pero contraste con la versión real que se verá de la actualidad televisual. La revolución no se retrata haciendo un mero balance de lo real, por ejemplo, entrevistando campesinos que han emigrado y viven ilegalmente en los precarios solares de Centro Havana, como Havana también hace, pero en juxtaponer estos testimonios con otras crónicas tachadas, otros proyectos sin consumar. Y aquí podemos ver, si pasamos 2 diapositivas para adelante, básicamente lo que quiero enfatizar, veo que no voy a poder hablar de Agnes Varda más en detalle, pero para dar un panorama de lo que estoy diciendo, estoy buscando ejemplos donde rige otra problemática, donde el viaje en Cuba tiene otro significado. Y aquí pongo 2 ejemplos de archivo de la instancia también de Christensen en Cuba. Uno donde se ve como artistas en Cuba buscaban, con el intercambio, buscar un espacio de libertad que quizás no se entendía en las imágenes mitificadas que se daba de Cuba en los años 60, y otra en que una visión interna de Cuba es más expansiva de lo que podríamos parecer, donde, por ejemplo, se puede escribir en un memorándum desde el ICAIC, pero escribiéndolo en danés. Si pasamos a la sí, aquí tenemos...
Ya llegaste con 10 minutos, pero no pasa nada, 2 o 3 minutos más.
2 o 3 minutos. Bueno, aquí tenemos las 3 visiones que las 3 películas que discuto dan de Fidel. La primera esta es de la película de Varda, que son más de 2000 fotografías de Cuba montado en película. De hecho, la única escena rodada es en París, donde pone a documentalistas franceses a bailar rumba. Pero no se ven escenas de rumba en Cuba. Esto es su foto famosa de Fidel como ángel con alas de piedra. Y si pasamos a la siguiente, la visión de Fidel de Guillaume Landrian, una interpelación casi inapelable, omnipresente, o sea, en el sentido que ocupa el espacio de la pantalla, pero no aparece explicado de forma didáctica, es básicamente una presencia ominosa. Y la tercera, en la película de Bokova, que obviamente es mucho después, en el 89, donde Fidel se ha vuelto como un fenómeno meteorológico. Fidel tampoco se ve aquí, pero ahora no es ominoso, es irónico, porque los discursos de Fidel se contraponen a imágenes de cotidianidad, de jubilo, de fiesta, y no se toman muy en serio. Y si pasamos a la última diapositiva, podemos ver que Bokova es una persona muy poco estudiada, pero que anticipa mucho lo que viene después, en los años 90, incluso en los 2000, en el sentido de entrecavar entre las ruinas, no solo arquitectónicas, pero también del discurso mitificador de la revolución, y buscar mostrarlo de otra manera, con una mirada irónica. Entonces me pareció como muy apto esta foto de el espacio de las escuelas de arte, un proyecto utópico no acabado, con la intervención ahí artística de los estudiantes que escriben Exilio, pero ya obviamente sancionado. En cambio, la película de Bokova circuló clandestinamente en Cuba, así que mucho menos sancionado esa visión en 1989 que en 2015. Y con eso concluyo.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Gabriel. Perfecto. Yo creo que vamos a dejar como 4 minutos, 5
4
minutos,
minutos, sí.
5 minutos para preguntas y comentarios, y después seguiremos con los otros panelistas. ¿Algún comentario, alguna pregunta? Jean, Stubbs, tienes la mano alzada. Jean. William todavía, pero no sé si la has bajado.
No, es que, perdón, no sé.
Okay. ¿Dónde ves la mano?
It's stuck up there, it's from last time.
Ah, bueno, Arnold, aquí viene Arnold con una pregunta.
Sí. ¿Escuche? Sí. Quería saber si entendí bien. Una película sobre la Declaración de La Habana fue dedicado a Huey Newton, algo así. ¿No? ¿A quién?
No, puse lo de Declaración de La Habana ahí porque precisamente por la idea de que Cuba se erigió en epicentro. Hay una cita ahí con la foto. Esa foto es de un disco que se grabó, creo que se comercializó en Italia y quizás también en Latinoamérica, pero el disco se imprimió en Italia, en donde se vendió el discurso como LP. Pero la cita es de Martínez Estrada, que residió en Cuba y que justamente habla de la idea o la vocación de la Revolución Cubana de ser algo no solo que uniría a Latinoamérica, pero que ese discurso se escucharía en el mundo entero. De hecho, Martínez Estrada, que es simpatizante fervoroso de la Revolución, dice que la primera declaración se dio entre 500.000 personas, pero si consultas a EcuRed hoy en día, dice que fueron más de 1 millón.
Bueno, y William, ¿una pregunta, un comentario?
Y lo de Huey Newton, perdóname. Huey Newton solo lo mencioné, que es curioso que la recepción que tuvieron muchos intelectuales americanos y europeos, pero sobre todo americanos en este caso, como C. Wright Mills, Waldo Frank, aunque él también cayó en desgracia, y Saul Lando, fue una recepción muy personal por parte de Fidel, que pasó mucho tiempo con ellos, que los invitó a su cabaña a pescar. Pasó 72 horas con C. Wright Mills, por ejemplo, pero con Huey Newton delegaron ese tour a otra gente, no lo invitaron a casa de Fidel.
Bueno, William, no sé si tenías una pregunta, y también Michael Shannon.
No, William's gone down.
William, ya bajaste la mano. Michael, ¿quién tenías una pregunta o un comentario?
Hello, yes. I thought there was a very interesting characterization you gave of the travelogue which doesn't follow the expected itinerary. And I wonder if you could see that also in much more recent films. For example, even Sweet Havana of Fernando Perez, a Havana which is not the one that you expect to see. And although I haven't seen it yet, I'm wondering about the new film by Hubert Soper, which is called Epicentrum. Yeah.
Yes, I'm also very excited to see that. I haven't seen that. I would think, I would, for a recent film, I would point to Kim Phillips' film as a film that I'm interested in, the title of which is now just flown out of my head. Well, which is about the sea. And what's interesting about her and what fits in with a lot of my research, this is a small piece of a chapter in my dissertation. What's interesting about her is that she also is a long-term resident in Cuba. She taught for 5 years at the school I mentioned in the text in San Antonio de los Baños. But then the film she makes is very much not sympathetic. It's not a denunciation, but it's a very, very critical and harsh vision of Cuba, and it's also a vision of a part of Cuba that's not seen in the usual tour, as it were.
Which part of Cuba?
I wish I could name. It's in the Gulf of Batabanao, a small town called. It's a fishing village on the Gulf of Batabanao.
And who did you say is the filmmaker?
Kim Phillips.
Kim Phillips. Okay.
Who's British as well.
Right. And can I just follow up with one other suggestion for you? It seems to me this would also, your theme could also relate to other films made by Cuban filmmakers who have left and are looking back at Havana. Of which I can think of several examples over the last 10, 15 years. Perhaps we should be in communication about this.
Thank you. I'd look forward to that.
Excellent. So unless there's any burning questions, which maybe we could leave to a chat, we'll say thank you to Gabriel. Gabriel, I know it's been a Herculean task, but you did it so well done. You can now relax and listen to the other papers, and that's great news. So we're going to move over now to Chris Hull, who's going to be talking to us about Graham Greene's Havana. Again, there's a text which is on the files that you can access later, and Chris has got a map. Chris, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Can hear me. Do we want to see you, or do we just want to see the map?
There we are, yes.
We want to see you.
You'll be able to see me now, yeah.
Do you want the map for the entirety
No,
of your presentation?
I'll give you the signal part when yeah. Unfortunately, the audience is going to have to look at me for a few minutes. So yeah, me again. Sorry, talking about Graham Greene yet again. How much you know, squeezing the lemon to the final pips, but the project has moved on a little bit, and basically this is one benefit that's come out of COVID and lockdown is that suddenly my department had research money to spend because all our plans went up in the air. Nobody could travel, nobody could go to conferences, and we had money to spend in a hurry. And I came up with a proposal that was a few years old and that the department didn't go with. And thanks to COVID, we are going with. So this is what I'm here to talk to you about today. And hopefully it will be an impact case study, not obviously for this round of REF, but for the following round of REF. And basically what it is, it's a mobile phone app, free to use a mobile phone app, whose provisional title is Graham Greene's Havana. And its aim is targeted at an audience of independently minded and culturally curious visitors to Havana, although it won't exclusively be for people who visit Havana. You'll be able to listen to it and follow it from whichever part of the world you happen to be in. So the idea is to take visitors back to the real and imagined Havana of Graham Greene, whose iconic novel, I'm sure most of you have heard of, Our Man in Havana, was published in October 1958, just 12 weeks before the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. His iconic spy fiction satire came about when Greene was deported from Puerto Rico in the summer of 1954, when he answered rather too honestly the stock US immigration question, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? Graham Greene had joined the Communist Party as a prank while at Oxford in 1925. He'd been a member for 4 weeks. In a slightly mischievous mood, as I say, he answered yes, and he was deported from San Juan via Haiti to Havana. So he arrived on an unplanned visit in the summer of 1954, or you could say that he'd gone on holiday by mistake, to quote a very good cult film, which some of you might know about. His eyes were opened by the debauchery on offer in Batista's Havana. What he experienced in Havana in 1954, both on this and another visit later that year and in 1956, led him to resurrect a story that he'd abandoned, that was originally set in Tallinn in Estonia, for a satire about an intelligence officer who invents espionage to increase his remuneration. This phone app, guides users around 10 localities, mostly in Old Havana, and all still existing, setting them in their political, historical context. Now, the wider context, of course, in the 1950s is the Cold War and the arms race, two features, in fact, of his novel Our Man in Havana. Graham Greene's personal context, which will also be covered in the app, was his long drawn-out love affair with the American-born wife of a wealthy Labour politician and landowner in 1954 and 1956. They both visited a live sex show in Havana and tried to procure cocaine. It turned out to be boracic powder. Unfortunately, just ahead of his trip to Havana in November 1957 to definitively begin writing Our Man in Havana in this Seville Biltmore hotel, she dumped him. So this is part of the story as well, or at least the story surrounding the Seville Biltmore hotel stop on the app. November 1957, of course, was the midpoint of the anti-Batista insurrection led by Fidel Castro. So what are the objectives of the app? To produce a dynamic and impact case study with built-in measurability, to offer free of charge an engaging cultural and heritage experience to international tourists, but not just international tourists, maybe to Cubans themselves. And if there's some more funding down the line, we'd like to do a Spanish version as well as an English version. To teach users about Cuba's pre-revolutionary history. The app will hopefully engage its users with their immediate surroundings, if they happen to be in Havana, by telling them history where it actually happened. To extend, and I think this is one of the most important points and something that chimes with me and has chimed with me on many visits to Cuba, is to extend the visitors' awareness of foreign literary figures in Havana beyond Ernest Hemingway, because everything in Havana seems to be, at least in the literary way, about Ernest Hemingway when it comes to foreign writers. To promote tourism more generally in Cuba, to increase footfall at some of the 10 locations in the app, and last but not least, perhaps to promote my non-fiction microbiography, Our Man Down in Havana, and its audio book version. If Pa would be kind enough to show the map, I'll give you'll get an idea of what it consists of, and I'll go through.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah, hopefully you might have to squint a little bit, but that's as good as we'll get, I think. So, as I said, 10. Let's start from the top. The British Embassy, obviously that is not the current location of the British Embassy, but the old British Embassy used to be on the top 3 floors of the drab Bolivar building, which is actually right next door to the fairly newly opened Packard Hotel. Why is that there? Because Greene visited the embassy on the second day of the first full day of his 1957 visit, and the British Embassy staff told him how they'd been live witnesses to the attack on the presidential palace by the Directorio Revolucionario in March 1957. And the presidential palace, number 2, obviously ties in with that. Number 3, the Sea Fury plane, which you can see right next to the Grama, behind the presidential palace, or in the gardens of the presidential palace. Greene was involved in protesting about the sales of British arms to Batista's government in the summer and the autumn of 1958. These included Comet tanks, of which no example remains, but one of the Sea Fury planes is there behind the what's now, of course, the Museo de la Revolución. There's an extra little story about the Sea Furies, in that one of the Sea Furies sunk 2 of the main supply vessels of the CIA-sponsored invading force at the Bay of Pigs a few years after Our Man in Havana was published. Let's skip to the Hotel Sevilla Biltmore. Now, of course, the Sevilla Hotel, where Greene stayed on his visits prior to the revolution, where he set a scene in room 501 of the hotel, where James Wormald, the main protagonist of the film, is recruited into MI6, or the Secret Intelligence Service. Sloppy Joe's Bar, just behind around the corner from the Sevilla Hotel. Another scene in the book, and an important scene in the film version of the novel, and also where during the filming of the film version of Our Man in Havana in April, May of 1959, a few months into the revolution, Greene was introduced to Ernest Hemingway, and they had a very brief and awkward encounter, which Greene later described as Hemingway's attitude seemed to be that Greene was muscling in on Hemingway's territory. El Floridita, of course, which, as we know, is known as Hemingway's favorite drinking hole, but Greene very much enjoyed spending lunchtimes there, drinking dry martinis and eavesdropping on the conversations of other clients. Doesn't seem that he ever bumped into Hemingway there, which is just as well. Iglesia del Santo Cristo.
You've had your 10 minutes, so maybe another couple.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I'll skip through these. Yeah, so Shanghai Theatre, perhaps, which is number 12, you can see there on the bottom left-hand corner of the map. That definitely is one that doesn't exist, but was a favourite hangout of Graham Greene, where he took his American-born mistress famously. And then you've got a trio of locations. Well, there are 4 there, but the app will only cover 3 of them. Those 3 hotels, the Capri, the Capri and the Havana Hilton, which were opened in the 1950s, and that sort of tourism boom that preceded the revolution, and the Hotel Nacional, where I don't think I've got to go into too much detail about the Hotel Nacional, but Greene stayed there in '63 and in 1966 in his post-revolutionary visits. I've just gone over time. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris. And we've got a couple of minutes for questions or comments from anybody. Is that Michael with his hand up?
Jean's got a hand up because she doesn't know how to put it down, and that's fine. Arnold, do you have a question? And
no, Michael, not. No.
Okay, there's a chat.
No, that was from before.
That's from before. That's fine. So, can I ask a question, Chris, or just a comment? You said it'll have inbuilt measurability. This is a very techie question. What are you measuring? Footfall or interest?
Well, of course, yeah. Well, first and foremost, the number of people that use it, that download it. We hope to, for example, perhaps include a quiz at the end to test people have been listening and paying attention. So that would sort of measure that people have interacted with the app. Yeah, that sort of thing. There are some more ambitious aspects to it, which let's see if they happen or not, because they partly depend on the cooperation of Cuban institutions. But yeah, I think the main one would be that how many people have used it, and of course there'll be an opportunity for users to comment on it. Which would be useful, especially at the beginning, to see that people are using it okay and finding their way around.
Excellent. And sorry, I completely overlooked Steve. Steve, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Hello again after all this time.
Hi, Steve. Good to see you.
That's tremendous, Chris. Could I ask, though, I mean, given the fact that we're doing this virtually, aren't you planning to do a website where we can do this virtually without having to leave our living room?
Yeah, well, you will be able to, like I say, you will be able to use the app, outside Cuba. You won't need to be in Havana to follow it and listen to it. You just obviously won't be in the locations that are being talked about.
No, but I mean,
you
could get somebody in Cuba to film, and then you could have a virtual tour where you can visit the place virtually as well, surely.
Gotcha. Well, that's a possibility. Of course, that involves extra expense of something that's already, quite pricey, because the technology is quite involved and has to be outsourced. Can't be done in-house by the university. It's too specialist. But it's a nice idea, Steve. I don't say it might not happen, but that would be a good thing to do, and could possibly be done more economically by somebody in Cuba than obviously somebody going from here to do it, and producing some really good things on. One of the things I've caught up during the lockdown is there's a Cuba COVID channel which you can get via YouTube. Some really good things on there, like cultural things. There's some very good work being produced in Havana. Yeah, which maybe we could take advantage of. Yeah.
Right, so there are lots of people using the chat to direct people who've been listening and maybe don't have time to answer all the questions. So there's lots of comments to those of you. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, Chris. That was really interesting, both your papers. And we're going to move on to Teishan, who's the last paper for today. And then at 6 o'clock, we are going to all go and grab a drink or whatever it is that we do. Not boracic acid, I don't think, Chris. And we'll have a little bit of a more relaxing time. So, Teishan, are you there?
Yes, I am. And I think you have my PowerPoint. The problem with the PowerPoint is it is actually it's essentially an audio recording of me reading the paper. But I'm here, and I may as well read you the paper. You have to stare at me, unfortunately, instead of the single PowerPoint slide that I used. But I wonder if that would be better. It's the same amount of time. Whatever you feel would be most appropriate.
Fine with you. I think a live person is always better than a recording. Aren't they?
Okay, good. I apologize. I kind of misunderstood the online format of the conference, but here I am.
It's perfect because actually afterwards you can all listen to that again with Teishan's audio recording inbuilt, embedded in the PowerPoint. So do you want the slide, or can we just do without slide and look at your?
No, we'll just do it without slide. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Teishan.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So this paper is an examination of United States regime change campaigns against Cuba in the modern era. And I argue that in the years after the Cold War, Washington increasingly pursued its political objectives in Cuba through democracy promotion programs that framed independent Cuban civil society, not dissident social movements in Miami, as the primary theater of counter-revolutionary possibility. Funded through the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, and the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED, these campaigns sought to encourage the long-term conditions in Cuba through which a transition to a market economy and the end of the revolutionary process could occur. By training journalists and funding media projects, by cultivating grassroots leadership and encouraging a wide range of social movements, USAID and the NED funded programs intended to strengthen independent civil society in Cuba. Examining US-Cuba relations through the lens of democracy promotion illuminates new aspects of the historical engagement between the United States and Cuba. With the disintegration of the Soviet Union as a counterweight to US global power, Washington increasingly sought to maintain its influence in the hemisphere through soft power programs. US democracy promotion campaigns in Cuba reveal how the architects of US foreign policy increasingly came to view Cuban society as the key site of political change. Democracy promotion programs in Cuba have garnered a lot of attention. All of you are probably familiar with, the Zunzunio scandal, or, USAID's attempts to infiltrate, Cuban hip hop artists and movements earlier in the early 2000s. There was also a campaign to recruit Latin American youth to come to Havana and try to recruit dissidents. So these are things that are very well known. What I'm trying to do in this presentation is drill down a little bit more into the history of one of the U.S. regime change organizations that is less known, but actually plays a much more significant role in trying to cultivate dissident movements in Cuba. Democracy promotion campaigns have been predicated upon addressing real debates and contradictions within Cuban society. Questions such as the best way to raise living standards, the proper course for developing the economy while minimizing inequality, and the future of unresolved issues such as racism, low wages, and what some of our other speakers refer to as political inertia, as well as the growth of evangelical Christianity and its influence, and important concerns such as LGBTQ+ rights are areas of vigorous contestation in Cuba. Although principles of national sovereignty suggest that Cubans should have the right to decide these issues amongst themselves, free from the influence of a foreign power, the US government has attempted to leverage divisions within Cuban society with the hope of undermining the legitimacy of the government. And so I want to talk a little bit again about the National Endowment for Democracy, because it's really much less known, but I would argue much more influential. So it was co-founded by Ronald Reagan in 1982 and funded by the US Congress. One of the NED's primary objectives was to avoid the kind of covert programs of the CIA that had operated hidden in the shadows, as Ronald Reagan put it at the organization's White House inauguration in December 1983. Instead, the United States would further its political interests abroad openly through direct support for America's allies within civil society with money, training, technology, and print material. outlining his blueprint for the project in a speech at the British Parliament in the summer of 1982, a year before the United States invaded Grenada. Washington pledged that the new National Endowment Project would, quote, foster the infrastructure of democracy. This, he emphasized, meant, quote, a free press, unions, political parties, universities, which allows a people to choose their own way, to develop their own culture, to reconcile their own differences through peaceful means. The NED's proposed methods and the presence of CIA officials among those associated with its founding suggested continuity with Washington's prior regime change methods. Indeed, its aims about aiding democracy around the globe notwithstanding, the endowment's funding objectives conformed closely to the historical foreign policy aims of the State Department and the CIA, which have, of course, long maintained programs of direct aid to civil society allies abroad. As with its predecessors, the NED's programs would seek to aid political movements and institutions within foreign civil society that were sympathetic to US interests, including those working for violent regime change. And so, you know, as the NED's co-founder, Alan Weinstein, later acknowledged, he says, you know, quote, a lot of what we do today was covertly done by the CIA 25 years ago. While the NED funds humanitarian projects around the world, including some addressing inequality, anti-corruption, and women's empowerment, for instance, the NED is not a humanitarian agency. It is a political one formed by neoconservatives and cold warriors to promote Washington's geopolitical interests. The NED has been implicated in various coups and regime change operations, and I think this is relatively well known, you know, from Nicaragua, where the NED played a key role in helping to defeat the Sandinistas in the 1990 elections after almost a decade of civil society operations, to, of course, more recently, Venezuela, where NED-funded organizations played a significant role in the brief 2002 coup that removed Chavez from power, to Honduras, where it helped lay the groundwork for the 2009 coup against Zelaya. The NED's operations got underway in 1984 with the mission, as the New York Times put it, of competing in the worldwide struggle for people's minds by financing democratic institution building in foreign lands. By openly encouraging direct engagement between American business and civic leaders with their counterparts in nations that Washington hoped to influence, the NED was to become an important instrument for the US to advance its geopolitical interests in its battle against the alternative modernity of socialism. As Reagan phrased it at the British Parliament address, quote, "What I'm describing now is a plan and a hope for the long term, the march of freedom and democracy which will leave Marxism-Leninism in the ash heap of history." Among the NED's first long-term grantees related to Cuba was the Cuban American National Foundation, which of course their work in, you know, funding dissident movements and terrorism against Cuba is quite well known. As an entity that promotes ideas as power, it is important to understand how the NED defines ideas such as freedom. For the NED, the idea of freedom is rooted in American traditions of liberal democracy, which champion the role of private enterprise, property rights, market economies, and individual liberty as the proper foundations for freedom. However, these political traditions have often regarded more egalitarian interpretations or counterparts to these definitions, including collective goods and the right to education, health, housing, food, and access to the arts, as well as the prioritization of the most vulnerable as untenable in a true democracy or a true market democracy. For the NED, this narrow definition of freedom was maintained in part through selective readings of international philosophical traditions that centered liberal democratic interpretations of freedom while ignoring socialist ones. As the NED's first annual report put it, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights commits governments around the world to honoring the fundamental human rights that are guaranteed to citizens of the United States and other free societies. So the standard here is the United States. For the NED, these included those in Article 17, which protects the right to own property, Article 19, which is freedom of opinion and expression, and Article 21, which is about the right to take part in a government directly through free and fair elections. However, the NED's founding documents are silent about the UN Declaration's more egalitarian human rights protocols, including the right to a decent standard of living, which the UN defines as access to food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, and the right to education. These human rights, which are upheld in Cuba, were ignored by Washington, which focused solely upon liberty as defined by US-style liberal capitalist democracy. Needless to say, the US discourse of democracy promotion is riddled with double standards. We can imagine, for instance, the public reaction if Cuban intelligence agencies were found to be engaged in socialist promotion in the United States or the United Kingdom, funding and training activists with millions of dollars with the ultimate goal of overthrowing the system of capitalism in those countries. Yet while the NED's democracy promotion campaigns pose challenges for Cuban sovereignty, an overlooked effect has been making dialogue about important internal issues in Cuba far more difficult. US regime change programs that target Cuban civil society cast a shadow of suspicion over a wide range of legitimate Cuban social activists, including those with no ties to foreign entities. Social activism in Cuba, including on important issues such as the persistence of racism, the growth of evangelical movements and their influence, widening economic inequality in Cuba, the fight for LGBTQ+ rights and violence against women, is a diverse phenomenon, and the activists who engage these issues range from those who are supporters of the revolutionary process to those who are avowed dissidents. So they are not homogenous. Nevertheless, the rise of a political environment in which civil society is literally saturated with foreign regime change money makes for a delicate situation for state and populace alike in Cuba. Washington's attempts to recruit dissidents from Cuban civil society and social movements also risks driving a wedge between the Cuban government and its allies abroad, many of whom are sympathetic to struggles against racism, sexism, and conservative evangelicalism, and unaware that some of these movements in Cuba have received aid from the US government. Washington's attempts to use Cuban civil society to influence the future of the island, although overlooked, will continue to play a key role in the internal development of Cuban civil society, and democracy promotion campaigns in Cuba suggest continuity rather than rupture with Washington's historical attempts to maintain its influence in Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teishan. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes. Questions for Teishan? Any questions that were still, well, let's start with Teishan, and then if we still have time, anything that was still outstanding for Chris and Gabriel, because I could see there was some chat going on. So questions for Teishan. Jean's arm is getting very tired unless she has a question. Arnold's arm is probably getting very tired too.
And Steve Wilkinson.
And Steve, do you have a question, or is your arm just getting very tired?
I have a question.
You have
All
a
right,
question?
good.
Go ahead, Steve.
Fire away.
Hi guys. Hi Teishan. Well done, Teishan. Can I just point something out to you, Teishan, which might be useful? I was reading just recently that The Economist has a survey of democracy around the world every year, and it's downgraded the United States from being a full democracy to a flawed democracy. So when you talk about hypocrisy, you might want to point that out in your paper. But really well done. You've condensed a lot of stuff maybe a lot of us were already aware of, but brought it into one place, which is very, very helpful. And I'd really like to encourage you to try and get it published.
Thank you very much. That's definitely the hope. Yep.
Other questions, other comments? As I said, Teishan's paper with an audio is in the files. Can I ask a question for all three of you, just to bring this paper together a little bit? And it's probably not going to be formulated very well because my brain's a bit fried from the technology. But anyway, let me try. That all of you are talking in some shape or form and in very, very different ways about the right to envision Cuba in the way that one feels is appropriate. Okay, and we've also had papers that have done something quite different because they've talked about the importance of national sovereignty in Cuba. So could you just address that? Because I get very uncomfortable in my own research when we can't help but judge and opine and shape and interpret, but I get very uncomfortable when I get very uncomfortable with that. So I'm not going to say when. Could you just address that? Because you've all touched on it in different ways, that you can shape Cuba from the outside in any way that you want. But many Cubans would argue back that actually it is Cuba's role to shape itself. In any order that you want.
I mean, I can offer a couple of thoughts since it seems to be provoked in a little bit way, sort of by the kind of intervention that I was making. So I think the tension here, of course, is between sovereignty in Cuba and Cuba's right to determine its own internal affairs, and really the rights of Cubans on the island to determine their own internal affairs in whatever way they want. But this tension, of course, does not mean that those who feel themselves to be allies of various causes, in Cuba, from a plethora of different kind of political standpoints, let's say, don't have a right also to engage their allies and their comrades and those that they, know and love and support, in Cuba. And of course, it's a delicate balance because this will look like many different things. One of the things that I certainly want to avoid in a presentation like this, and this is obviously part of a much longer work, a chapter, book project, but I certainly don't want to suggest that all of the foreign governments and all of the foreign NGOs that are doing humanitarian or are various kinds of civic engagement in Cuba are covertly engaged in some kind of destabilization effort, right? And the problem with this conversation also is that, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it casts a shadow over a lot of very important social movements that are occurring in Cuba that are not homogenous, that have a lot of different diverse components. But many of those components are indigenous to Cuba. They are not funded or created from the outside. But the United States would really like to find a way to manipulate this, to find a way to use it, to its own ends.
It strikes me that, sorry to just come back on that, it strikes me that one of the areas of greatest inequality is in terms of not just the power to envision and opine, but the power then to make public that vision. And obviously what happened with Google not that long ago when La Soberana was first announced, those are just very small examples of a much larger picture that I say with my students that, it's much easier to get an outside view of Cuba than it is to get an inside view of Cuba. And therefore, the differential in terms of access to communication and divulgation of dissemination of ideas is the real sticking point, not the flow of ideas and the allies and the alliances, as you say.
Yeah, and I think a key part of this also is the role of the independent press in Cuba, which is also a very diverse phenomenon. 3 of the best known Cuban news sites in the United States, which are CubaNet, Diario de Cuba, and Hypermedia, are funded by the US government. But that doesn't mean that all the others are. It doesn't mean that all Cuban journalists who are independent are, funded from, some foreign government, right? But what this U.S. intervention does is it muddies the water, right? It casts a cloud of suspicion over everyone, and also grants cover to a lot of people as well.
Yeah. Any more questions? We've got a couple of minutes left.
Or do you both want to respond, Gabriel or Chris? If there's no other questions.
You don't have to, but if you've got something.
Oh, Alf. Alf would like to make a comment. Alf, do you want to make yourself visible and audible?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to respond. I was just unmuted.
Go for it, Gabriel. Go for it.
Yeah. I would just say that it's important to understand when you're talking about envisioning Cuba that at least in the 1960s, which is the area I'm most comfortable talking about, but really, well, there's a change in emphasis in terms of how Cuba presents itself to the outside world. There's a very concerted effort and a very sincere effort by a lot of cultural and political actors beyond who we might think of as the leaders of the Cuban Revolution to recruit people to come and give accounts of Cuba. So much so that it's a rhetoric in itself, the travel log to Cuba. It's a genre. But I think what's interesting is that, for example, with this Varda film, one of the biggest champions of the Varda film was Gustavo Arcos Bernies, who was at the time the ambassador of the revolution in the UK, but who maybe I want to say 2 or 3 years after the film was made, was given a quite long jail sentence. And then he's an interesting figure. But in any case, he's out there promoting a certain vision of Cuba, a certain vision of the revolution, and saying this Varda film is excellent because it's not a sort of didactic militant film, but it's a very subtle piece of propaganda, and that's why it's good for us to show that this is what's really happening in Cuba. It's not all, everything is not glorious, but this is better that we promote this vision. But let's just say that that particular line of thinking, in terms of having intellectuals represent Cuba or envision Cuba to the outside world, international ones, it gets cut off, and someone like Gustavo Arcos winds up spending about 30 years in jail. Not because of that per se, but you can't say that he's someone who's backed by the CIA. So it's a little bit what you were referring to in your paper, Teishan. Getting caught up in the dragnet.
Getting caught up, yeah. Okay, sorry, Laurence and Alf.
Just very quickly, I mean, civil society in Cuba is changing. There's partly because of generational change, partly because of the change in rules, which enabled Cubans to travel abroad and come back. And alter the balance within families and so on and so forth. So there's a sort of transnational aspect to Cuban civil society now, which probably didn't exist before, and which cannot be instrumentalized nearly so easily by the Trump regime, and which deserves respect for people who care about the well-being of the Cuban people.
Thank you, Laurence.
Excellent. Michael, Alf and Michael. So Alf first and then Michael.
Yes, thank you very much for all these wonderful papers. It's very, very exhilarating, very promising for me for the first time seeing this. And I thank you, Pa and Tony, for organizing this and all those who contributed. It really is so valuable to spend a day with intellectuals like you guys. That is really wonderful. I wanted to talk about the thing about the government, the U.S. government. Now, with the elections coming, it is going to be extremely difficult. If by any chance Trump wins, we've seen that what he has done in this year has been much more than any president of the sanctions in every single sector of Cuban society. And we're just, I've been into Zoom meetings where I have been in contact with people from America who have been part of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign meeting and who have been very supportive of the campaign in America. And I'm just wondering if it, by any chance it happened, which obviously nobody wants, but if it happened, what are the forces in American society that are ready to actually manifest, to do something against Trump vis-a-vis Cuba and possibly vis-a-vis Venezuela? Thank you.
Teishan, do you want to respond? Or?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of my previous work in scholarship is actually about American solidarity with Cuba and the Cuban Revolution in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And one of the things that grew out of that, which continues today, is a block of activists and and intellectuals that that agitate against the U.S. embargo against Cuba, that are agitate against U.S. policy. And it's it's small, but it's small but vocal. And they have had some political success, but but it's not support for Cuba among the left in the United States is not as widespread as it was in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And why that is a long explanation, but it's more difficult to make the case for defending Cuban sovereignty in the United States right now, due to the internal conditions, the political conditions in the United States, due to the new focus of the U.S. left, which is much more internal and less focused on the the consequences of American foreign policy, but also has other things to do is related to other things as well. But yeah, there are absolutely movements and activists here that have, that have agitated against the U.S. blockade and U.S. policy against Cuba for a long time. Unfortunately, if Trump does win, we will have to, renew that activism.
Excellent. And I think what is our last question, if I'm not mistaken, which is Michael.
It's not so much a question as referring back to things that Gabriel was talking about, and also Arnold talking about press coverage. Back in 1986, I made a film for Channel 4, Dispatches, Current Affairs program, as a result of being invited to do so by the Cubans. I'd gone to them with a different project, and they had come back and said, very interesting, but how would you like to do something on political prisoners? And they delivered. It's a long story, and I'm not going to tell it all now, but particularly relevant to the framework that we're discussing here. When one does something like that as an independent filmmaker, one is supposed to contact the Foreign Office before you go, in order that, obvious, right? Okay, the Foreign Office's reply, I didn't do that because an MEP at the time said that just before, she'd done that just before going on a visit to Cuba, and had been told by the Foreign Office, why are you going? That's a Washington story. In other words, the Foreign Office here had the attitude that independent British journalists and politicians and so on, even, should not be going to Cuba.
Right.
I think on that note, thank you all very much. I think we need to make ourselves as visible as we want with a glass of whatever it is that we're going to drink. Please feel free to go off and attend to the rest of your lives if you need to do that. We would have had a conference dinner, wouldn't we?
We would have, and we would have had a drink and a conference dinner, and we would have had the real fun part of the conference, which is having a drink and chatting to people, new people and older people that we knew before. So let's try and do that. That was the idea of having a little bit of space. We've got it booked till 9 o'clock if you really want to. But there are 30 odd of you currently on at the moment, so I'm certainly going to go grab a drink.
And one for me.
I know Pa's ordered hers already.
So my order in Italy. So see you in a few minutes. Okay, back for a drink in a few minutes. Anybody who wants to stay. If not, we start tomorrow with the film at 10:30. You have the link on the program. You have the link on Vimeo, so you could watch it yourselves if you don't want to get up and watch it. But it'd be nice to have a group watching it. And discussion until 12:30. And we start the conference again at 1. Salud a todos.
Right, a drink.
Bye.
Bye, hasta mañana para los que se van.